Recorded on location at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library, you're listening to Chicago Stories, a podcast featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans and special guests, as told to Mayor Emanuel.
This is Mayor Emanuel with Kyle Longley here at the LBJ Presidential Library. This is Chicago Stories. Kyle just came out with a book, LBJ's 1968, Power, Politics, and the Presidency in America's Year of Upheaval. We'll try to deal with each of those.
Right.
Power separately. But since we are in the process in the city of Chicago of building a presidential library, what would be like your one takeaway of how to have a city and the Presidential Museum Library integrated in the sense of they're not two separate worlds or separate orbits?
Well, I don't think.
And what's the best takeaway here?
Yeah, I think the best takeaway is you look at the cultural value here of the institution here in Austin. Mm-hmm. Austin's a wonderful city with many cultural institutions, but this one sort of stands out. Mm-hmm. President. This remarkable museum that has been created, this building. We have a strong association with the University of Texas. They're very strong supporters of the institution. Mm-hmm. So I think you walk away just understanding, we have about 200,000 visitors come through each year, and they're learning about Lyndon Johnson. A lot of them are students. In fact, today we have a group of college students coming up from San Antonio, about 40 of them, and many of them have never even been to a museum. This is going to be their sort of initiation. So it's not just Austin, it's the whole Central Texas. And Texas has advantages because we have 3 presidential libraries, and they're all valuable cultural institutions.
Well, we have 2. We got Lincoln and Obama.
You do and do. Texas.
I understand you guys play big.
Oh, well, I'm a native Texan, so, it's always we Texans.
Game on. We're ready to have the next race,
well,
okay?
I'm the son of a Texas football coach. We're ready to go.
We just walked through. As I was telling you, I feel like a kid in a candy store walking through. And I want to start with, while a lot is around his record on Vietnam, civil rights, etc., we just got a report this week about the advantages of Head Start and what it has done for kids, etc. Where did Head Start fit in his kind of, given it's a very long domestic agenda,
right.
And obviously civil rights plays a prominent role, but so do economic justice.
Right. Well, I think Head Start fits very well into his sort of worldview, and his worldview is education is the key to breaking the cycle of poverty. Mm-hmm. If you can't have access to education, it's not going to change a trajectory over the long term. I just came from a university in Arizona, which 40% of our students were first generation. Mm-hmm. And we knew the statistics showed if they made it through that college years and got a college degree, it changed the whole family's trajectory. Didn't need far beyond, but especially theirs and their children. Mm-hmm. And we know education is a key. Unfortunately, we don't prioritize it too often, but it is the key. And Lyndon Johnson, being an educator himself, understood that very much.
So you think that comes from the one-room school?
Oh, very much so.
Where he's a high school teacher?
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate, for example, on the civil rights issue, the importance of him working with Mexican-American children in Cloture, Texas, and in Houston. Mm-hmm. That changed his whole worldview. And he not only did this in terms of civil rights for African Americans, which was a fundamental cornerstone, it was for Latinos, it was for Native Americans. It extended across the board. I would even argue he sets a tone that will even be carried into the LGBT. I don't think there's any small coincidence Stonewall occurs not long after the Johnson presidency.
If you said Johnson City, Texas, from Johnson County, if I'm not, is it?
No, it's
in the Hill Country.
It's in the Hill Country.
That would not have been the place I would have said, here's going to be the land from the great civil rights. This is going to be the break moment in America. And obviously there's a lot of work that goes in the South with Dr. King and others that proceed. And without that work, he would not have been.
No.
But Johnson City would not be one of the many ground zeros of the civil rights movement. No. What changed for him? Because that's not where he starts his career.
Right.
What are the milestones of his evolution as a civil rights? Because that's not where he is as a congressman or a senator until later in the Senate year.
I would argue maybe to the contrary that it was there, but the problem is you're a Texas senator.
You're supposed to argue.
Yeah.
This is a Jewish dinner table.
Oh,
go
okay.
Ahead. Just go ahead and let it rip.
Yeah, well,
we'll let all your disagreements out.
That's always fine. But I would argue it was probably there much deeper than you think because it was based on the socioeconomic. And again, it goes back to when he was a teacher. He saw the injustice, and it bothered him. But as a Texas senator, if he had gotten too far ahead, he wouldn't have been a Texas senator for very long. So I think going into the vice presidency helped him sort of make some transitions. But I would argue there's a fundamental
So every time the platform got bigger, He could expand past his being captured by where he was.
Exactly. And so I think that fundamental sense of fairness was there. I mean, he comes out of, a hard scrabble, the poverty that is there in Central, it's not today, but it was then. And so, he's overcoming, goes to Southwest Texas Teachers College, basically, and he goes and meets the Kennedys who went to Harvard. He's got his own issues there in terms of what he sees as a fundamental sense of fairness. And again, his teaching in Cloture, I think, is transformative.
People talk about his mother, but his father's torment of him plays a dominant role in kind of the personality becomes Johnson. What is that?
Well, I think the fundamental thing that people don't understand is he was very insecure.
Yeah.
His persona doesn't portray that, but deep down he's very insecure. He is coming from not a well-established education. He's not coming from money. He's just in the Washington, D.C. circles. He's, seen as sort of, a country boy. Yeah, and I think he's always working to overcome that, and he's always driven. I think that's the other part that and most politicians, that is a fundamental drive. Richard Nixon, all of them. Nixon's trying to overcome his own ghost.
When I look as an amateur history, forget the fathers, it's the mothers. Presidential history, that is. It is all rooted in the mother's expectations.
I don't disagree with that at all. His mother's had high expectations. He is the golden child. He's the one that stands out to all people. Whether it's his first grade teacher or whomever it may be. So Johnson definitely, but he's carrying it. There's other things. I'll give you another example. We're doing a big event in May on Felix Longoria. He was a World War II veteran killed in the Philippines. He was to be brought back in 1949 to Three Rivers, Texas, to be buried. And there was a controversy over whether they were going to let the wake happen at the funeral home. So President Johnson got involved, and he thought it was a fundamental sense of unfairness. So he had Felix Longoria buried in Arlington Cemetery. And we're doing a big event on May 14th to honor the 70th anniversary of the Felix Longoria affair. We're focusing on what's the long-term, because there he meets Hector Garcia, who is the head of the GI Forum, one of the leading Latino civil rights organizations that this jumpstarts the Latino civil rights movement in the state of Texas.
Roosevelt's the president in the Depression that gets, for the working man. While Johnson admires Roosevelt, and that's his North Star, he declares it a war on poverty, and it's not about the working man in the middle class. That's for another time.
No.
Over some beer and tacos, we'll talk about whether
Sounds good.
Okay.
Or barbecue.
Oh, that's fine by me too. Tell me who came up with the title that it'd be on poverty, and does he have any regrets that it was about poverty and not a larger part of America at that moment? And could America only do it given its wealth at that moment?
Well, I have to admit,
there's like 20 questions in there.
Yeah,
Pick any one of the 20 you want.
I don't have the origin story. I won't lie. I'm still learning as I go. And there's so much there. Robert Cairo's up to about 5,000 pages. And I think he's only up
he's
to
out of kindergarten.
Yeah, he's only in 1966. So, there's just so much there. But what I would say is I don't think he ever regrets that.
The title, War on Poverty versus either war or poverty versus where the focus is of economic equity. Or economic equality or economic justice.
So I don't think he ever regrets that. And I think it's actually...
Do you think he thinks about it?
Oh, I think Johnson thought about it.
Because he's a very political...
Yeah.
He knew words, he knew images.
Yeah, he knew words and images with the best. The famous saying, he says, I only think about politics 16 hours a day. So, so I think that really represents Lyndon Johnson quite well. But, this was, again, it goes back to that fundamental sense of fairness, how we're going to uplift all people. Not just particular groups. We're going to give everybody that opportunity that he had actually benefited from. Was he as disadvantaged as some in Central Texas? No. He had some advantages, but he still had to struggle.
No, because I think about later, and you think about what happens in the 66 election, and people go south, and it was more inclusive than just people in poverty and uplifting them, that it took in other people's economic opportunity.
Right.
Would he have sustained the support for, quote unquote, the war on poverty? And he being a political person, that to me seemed like I'll say it, bad choice of words, given that, and nobody can predict what's going to happen in 67, 68, where the country begins to turn its back on what it seemed as people ungrateful to the efforts being done. That's what I think he understood.
Well, Johnson, couldn't have predicted Watts in 65, which really started a backlash. He couldn't have predicted a lot of these. For example, I've done a lot of work on the 68 Fair Housing Act. Well, that started in 66, and it really cost the Democrats that year, including Paul Douglas his seat, because the national realtors come out against this. How can you force this? There are going to be bureaucrats telling you who you have to live by. You can just guess what the backlash was. Gerald Ford
It's
led.
racial.
Yeah,
That's
and so, it created so many of these things, but he was committed. And in 68, after the death of Martin Luther King, that was a signature piece that he was able to pass. But he needed a lot of things to come to be. One, Everett Dirksen flipped. He had originally opposed it, and he then said, well, if I'm a politician, why can't I change my mind? I thought that was a great line from Everett Dirksen. So, I'm trying to hit your Illinois connections.
No,
here.
I got you're doing great. We'll see if you really know your stuff when we get to pizza and the Cubs.
I won't lie on that. Bears, yes.
But there's a tension in Johnson between his goals on racial equality and his goals on economic opportunity. And that sits constantly because both of them are narrowcast, and he knows from Roosevelt you have to embrace everybody if it's going to be a unified mission.
Right.
And that, to me, is never really, unless you go through here, kind of explored. And given 68 such a year,
right,
and you can look back, what do you think about those tensions between his goals for civil rights and for the country and his goals for a war on poverty, and that they become parts of the country's mission, but not everybody's not included in that conversation?
Well, I think there's a couple of fundamental things we have to keep in mind that most people, you obviously understand this, but the Democrats in the 1960s were still split between those Southern conservatives, who oftentimes are his worst enemy, not the Republicans. It's those Southern
that's
Democrats.
True for Roosevelt too.
Yeah, and so he's fighting to overcome. I think there's also a separate issue there. Roosevelt's in the middle of the Depression. People are unified because they're thrown together. Vietnam has split people. Civil rights has split people. So it's a very divisive. And plus, there's affluence. Everybody's around. Look what America's done since 45. But so many are being left out. We're still having these debates today. Who's being left out of the rising ships? And Johnson never could rectify. But he also, by making the choices that he did, like on civil rights, after he said after the 64 civil rights, I just lost the Democratic Party, or the South to the Democratic Party. He knew what the ramifications were, but he knew it was the right thing to do. And I respect that personally.
In 68, and he decides he's not going to seek re-election. I mean, we talked a little about this. You have the 66 election.
Right.
The midterm, which is...
He takes a beating, 47
a
seats
shellacking.
lost. Yeah, 47.
Which is the equivalent to Kennedy's sixth term, which would have probably happened anyway.
Right.
And they bought real estate in 64. They should never have bought in that election.
Right.
But then you have the Tet Offensive. You have the 67 riots. You have Vietnam. Break that out, given your book, and kind of give... If I'm not mistaken, 3 months earlier, he's basically talking about his reelection, and he's also talking about not running. So simultaneously, he's having a dichotomy in his head. Well, unravel all that and try to do it in 20 seconds, can you? Okay.
He called it a year of a continuous nightmare.
68.
68. Pueblo starts, we've been dealing with the North Koreans for so long that we forget sometimes that, they seize our spy ship and hold 82 Americans hostage, and we don't get them back for about a year. So, and then you have Tet. It's just one thing after another. And he's being driven by a number of things. At the State of the Union address in 68, he had a section written in saying he wasn't going to seek re-election. Now, he holds on to that until March 31st, but it was there, ready to go. Horace Busby had written it for him. So he's thinking about it. And two things I think are driving him. One is, of course, health issues. Johnson men didn't live long. And he was afraid he was going to have – actually, he was more afraid he was going to stroke out rather than die. And he didn't want to
be impaired.
Yeah, and be in Woodrow Wilson's shoes, sitting in the top of the White House and his wife basically running the – I'm not saying Lady Bird, but I'm saying Woodrow Wilson.
I got what you mean.
But I think that's playing a role. And then again, Vietnam just haunting him. And now he's about to send his two son-in-laws off to Vietnam. And on March 31st, Linda comes back, and she arrives the day.
With Chuck Robb? You mean sending Chuck?
Chuck had just left for Vietnam. She had flown red-eye back on March 31st. And the first question she asked, why am I sending my husband off to fight for people that don't seem to want to fight for themselves? That was her first question to her father. And by the evening, he had made the commitment, I'm going to get us out of Vietnam. And in one of his last statements, he says on that night, I feel like on the day that I leave office, there will only be a few Americans left in Vietnam.
He wants to get out of Vietnam. He knows Nixon is playing with the peace talks.
He does.
How come he doesn't expose it?
Two reasons, major reasons. One is he doesn't have a direct tie to Nixon. We only really develop a little bit more of that knowledge later through John Dean's notes.
But he knows. The tapes are there, and you got two
He knows the
two great political operators with
Yeah.
great political minds, and they both know what the other one's doing and lying through their teeth to each other. So
Right.
why doesn't he expose Nixon? Is it his feelings for Humphrey?
No, I don't think so. I think that's one that's been portrayed, but I don't.
You don't buy it.
He gave Humphrey the information. Humphrey could have used it. Humphrey knew. He'd given him the intelligence and said, "Here, it's yours to use." But I think there's two things playing out. One is they know the campaign is through Anna Chenault, and they know John Mitchell. They've got them on tapes, and they're surveilling with the FBI.
Who knew that Putin would copy this? Okay, no, I'm joking.
I'm not touching
that. That was a free shot. Go ahead. Please go. We only got a certain amount of time.
We're in a government building. I have to fear the Hatch Act. But the other part of it is too.
You'll realize when you're not in the government how free it is.
I was a tenured professor with But to go back, I think there's two things. One is they can't make the direct tie to Nixon. They know that the campaign is, but they can't make it directly to Nixon. Mm-hmm. The other is he'd have to expose how he found out. And he didn't want to really give up his sources that he'd been surveilling American citizens, and this could have opened a big can of worms that's later opened.
From the FBI and using all the apparatus of the government.
Yes. And, I mean, we were spying on the South Vietnamese. We had bugs planted in the South Vietnamese presidential palace. Mm-hmm. We were doing a lot of things that he didn't really want exposed.
And that's what stopped him from confronting.
I think it's
publicly confronting.
Public.
I mean, privately he confronts Nixon.
Yeah, and
who lies to him.
Oh yeah,
and they both know each other are lying to each other.
Right, and then his aides are like, "Well, it's too close to the election. It'll look too partisan." Again, but he gave
same
it
thing that Obama had to face dealing with the Russian deal.
This book a lot resonates.
Mm-hmm.
68
contemporaneously.
Yeah, well, I mean, Fortas's nomination of to the Supreme Court, which they kill because they say Johnson is a lame duck president.
Okay, so here, Johnson loves Roosevelt, admires him, and sees his presidency as the second chapter of the Roosevelt New Deal, okay? Knows that Roosevelt's court packing is the great political mind screws it up. How does Johnson, who is equal to Roosevelt, screw up Abe Fortas? I don't get this. I don't understand how this happens, given he studied backwards and forwards everything Roosevelt did right and wrong. How did he get this one wrong?
Well, I think he's blinded by his relationship with Fortas, which is way too close for a Supreme Court justice to be coming to the White House and giving advice. So I think some of it goes into that. Mm-hmm. He hurts himself by nominating Homer Thornberry, a Texas protege, and so the accusation.
So a little clipped already.
Yeah.
The wings are clipped. Here.
Yeah, and then I think the times too. I mean, the pornography issues that Strom Thurmond raises in the middle of Fortas's,
what is
hearings.
Don't assume everybody knows.
Strom Thurmond brings up that Fortas and them had signed off on pornography, basically, and they had eased the rules.
You mean for the post office?
Yes,
for the cases.
And a number of things.
Sending Playboy and all the other stuff through the mail.
A number of things that they'd eased, and so that's turned. School prayer is a major issue that had originated in the early 60s. So the Warren Court is seen as this liberal court, but also they smell blood in the water because he is a lame duck president. And then Fortas is what they uncover on Fortas, like what he was taking from American University for supposedly teaching a course. There are a number of things at play here. But Johnson administration makes some fundamental errors. They alienate Richard Russell by not pushing forth a nomination of a federal judge.
In Georgia?
Yeah.
That would have been on the court there?
Yeah. And so they
How parochial of the Senate.
Well, no comment on that. But, I mean, if you look at it, there's a lot of missteps along the way. But he still should have – you thought he was going to win, and he still had a majority vote, but he couldn't get enough to break the filibuster. Yeah, couldn't get it. And
who was leading the Cloture fight? Was it the Dixiecrats on Fortas?
No, actually it was Robert Griffith, the junior Republican senator from Michigan. But they were in the behind the scenes. He and Richard Russell worked a deal that Johnson didn't even know about.
To screw. So Russell was back.
After end of June, after Russell felt he'd been screwed by Johnson over this nomination of this federal court judge, he turned.
So Russell's relationship with the president. Obviously, there's this famous moment, the Break Civil Rights Act, and Russell warns him what this means. But then throughout 65, 66 in his presidency, he's in constant contact about the war.
Right.
How close are they, or is Russell guarded? Is Russell really giving him the unvarnished truth about Vietnam and
I think so.
there?
I think so, but the problem is if Richard Russell, Uncle Dick, is giving him this kind of information, unfortunately it's being offset by Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, I mean the Hawk, Walt Rostow. I mean, if you just look at, basically the only one internal to the White House is George Ball for a long time.
Right.
That are giving him—
You mean the only internal contradictory voice?
Yeah, only internal dove. You know, McNamara goes back and tries to rewrite history later, that he was actually more concerned earlier.
Yeah.
I personally, looking at the
not
documentation, it was a rewrite of history. But Uncle Dick is still, they're close, but since Johnson 64 and 65 with the Civil Rights Act, Uncle Dick is not.
So he's putting landmines in the Senate?
Well, and some are at least being ambivalent.
Well, so this is not unwritten, but not explored a lot chapter. How much, given the way he ruled as a Senate Majority Leader, I clearly knew the legislative process, how much of his difficulty with the Senate, because he doesn't face it in the House, was some of his former colleagues wanting to get back for years of being under his thumb and the way he diminished them.
Right.
And I wouldn't use certain words, but basically took their manhood away from them.
Well,
so how much of that exists with Fulbright, with Russell, some of the, Humphrey, before he becomes, I think he waits a year before he names Humphrey, is it?
I think so, yeah. I think that's right. Well, I think it's there. And I'll give you a prime example. In 1960, Johnson came back over to the Senate and says, I'd like to preside. And Albert Gore stands up and says, hell no, that's not going to happen. And so Johnson is not happy. So, I mean, it even started before he became president. They saw some challenges, and they also, many of them just saw that we're in opposition. We're the Congress. We're another branch of government. We cannot be seen as collaborating so closely. But there are, Fulbright, that is one of the most interesting of the relationships.
Why is that?
Well, they break basically over the Dominican intervention in 1965. And then Fulbright starts giving a much more jaundiced view of Vietnam. Senator Gore, as early as 59, saying this is a major catastrophe. Mansfield, and Mansfield's even warning. Mansfield knew Asia better than anyone.
Right.
And they're warning him, and they're giving him warnings. But, Gore's doing it within the executive sessions of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So, he's not going to go out until about 64, 65. Same with Fulbright.
So how, you got two moments, you got Abe Forder's one on the court domestically, there are others. I still, for another day, I'll give my views about whether I would have called it the war on poverty. But that's obviously my questions indicate. How does, again, a political genius get caught in Vietnam, given he had his own doubts about it?
Oh, very much so.
And he had gone through Korea, saw what it did to Truman. Truman not seek re-election. You get Eisenhower. And it's early, how does this play out, given that his passion for life and for the presidency, Head Start, civil rights, housing, voting, higher education, how?
Oh,
because obviously we're all complex individuals.
Right. Well, I think it's inertia. I think Truman getting beat up for losing China plays a substantial role. To the Democrats.
Yeah, and Democrats as a whole, not just him.
Democrats as a whole. They don't want to be accused of losing another part of the world, especially Asia. So I think that's playing. He inherits Kennedy's advisors, most of which are hawks, and they had already been pushing this. The argument is always Kennedy would have pulled us out had he lived. I personally think that's—
Same for centrifugal forces would have pulled him
they
out.
would have pushed him. I mean, Johnson's got some great quotes. I feel like a Texas farmer in a hailstorm. There's nowhere to run, no place to hide. And I think that really sums up how he really felt. He didn't want that war. He wanted the war on poverty. He wanted to wage that, but he ended up having to fight for guns and butter, and he couldn't separate the two, and it brought his presidency to its knees in many ways. One person has called it the arsenic that took down the Johnson presidency. I think that's a very appropriate characterization.
You got, from his congressional days, and I've always loved this, we were talking about this earlier, Roosevelt meets him once at a train stop and says that guy's going to be president. So you have Roosevelt, you have Truman, you have Eisenhower, and then alongside Kennedy. So talk through each of the relationships he had. And then he's different points in his own career.
Right.
But each of them in his psyche, his role models, what they taught him, what they didn't, if you could.
Well, I think the role model, of course, is FDR.
Yeah.
How he tried to maintain a Democratic coalition of conservative Southerners with that and also push forward. But, Roosevelt didn't push civil rights. He couldn't even push the anti-lynching law. So Johnson definitely is going to be a break from that. Truman, a little less so. I mean, he's congressman and then senator. But he watches Truman. But you know where he goes to sign the Medicare bill? Goes to Independence, Missouri, because Truman had proposed universal health care. And so, there's elements of a lot of these things that he's going to. Eisenhower's foreign policy acumen and sort of even-keeled approach to the world, which had kept us out of a major conflict. And then Kennedy, of course, they served side by side. But in many ways, there's some tensions there, but not to the degree sometimes that are portrayed, I think.
You don't think they're
I don't think
envy, jealousy, and respect and admiration
I think
all
they're
together?
all they blend. I mean, I think they blend.
Forget
but,
Bobby Kennedy. For
Yeah,
a second.
Bobby is a totally different. They hate each other.
Yeah.
But
I thought mutual contempt captures it pretty well.
I think he did a wonderful job.
Yeah.
And I talk a lot about this. That one of the high points of this 68 book is that how he responds to Robert Kennedy's death, and he does it very presidential.
Yeah.
And
I read that book, and I brought Jeff Cecil in as a speechwriter for Clinton.
he's
Well, as soon as I read the book, I called him up and I said,
incredible book if you haven't read it.
The one thing, so obviously Roosevelt, because of the personality, the size of the people, et cetera, admiration for this patrician versus where he's from. But so much of Truman's journey into the White House, into the Oval Office, is Johnson's journey.
Yeah.
And I can't find it anywhere because I know what he thinks of Eisenhower. He's the Senate Majority Leader.
Right.
But Truman and him journey similar paths.
Right.
And they're accidental.
Yeah.
Johnson wanted the office, Truman didn't. But after that, it's pretty similar.
Very similar. Coming from similar backgrounds, having to move home with, Truman having to move home to his mother-in-law's. I mean, just a lot of things that are very similar. But, he's a congressman until 48, and then he's a junior senator. So there's not as much overlap there as far as potential for interaction. Eisenhower, of course, is Senate Majority Leader. He may be the most powerful Senate Majority Leader in the history of the United States. I would argue it may be the most effective in many ways, and I think we can make that argument. So he's got to interact with Eisenhower. Truman's just not as much, but they do come from a similar background. Again, he does respect
The unexpected president.
Yeah, he respects Truman greatly. Again, that's why he flies to Independence to sign the Medicare bill. I mean, he's paying homage to Harry Truman. He could have easily skipped that. But he understood the history of it, and I think that's very important. Lyndon Johnson understood a lot of these things. He's a politician of the highest level that, again, is brought down to a large degree by Vietnam. But he respected these people. And you're right. Here's an interesting point. March 29th, 1952 is when Truman announces he won't seek re-election. March 31st, 1968 is when Johnson announces.
I don't think I ever made that.
Yeah.
I mean, both are also where they come from.
Right.
Independence, Missouri.
Yeah.
Johnson City, Texas.
Yeah.
They're vice presidents to people that die in office.
Yeah.
Senators.
Yeah. So, I mean,
I never actually caught that day. That's interesting.
Yeah. So, writing this book, I honestly have to admit, until I wrote the book, I didn't put the two and two together. But it is, if you look at sort of the similar paths, he respected Eisenhower. And I think he respected him out of both his military service and his restraint. And Johnson, people don't give him as much credit for this. The man, he thought things through. And they'll say, well, he didn't think through Vietnam. Well, he thought it through. Unfortunately, he was getting a lot of...
No, when you look at McNamara, Dean Acheson, Eisenhower, all the foreign policy establishments...
They're behind it.
Until 100%, until it went bad.
Yeah, until March 26th or 27th of 1968, Acheson's behind it. But then the wise men come and say, it's over. And that helps flip the script on March 31st.
Where did he place the whole healthcare agenda, Medicare, Medicaid? Why did he decide not to follow Truman and Roosevelt with national healthcare, but where does Medicare and Medicaid evolve as the initiative as opposed to universal national healthcare?
Right. Well, I think what it does is they've learned.
I mean, I'm glad he left something for me to do with my life.
Right. Yes.
So if he had done that, I don't know, who would have ever said never allow a good crisis to go to waste?
Exactly.
So why does he decide to? I wouldn't say trim the sails because you can't say that about Medicare, Medicaid, but not replicate what Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin, and Truman do?
Well, I think part of the reason is he recognizes political wins. Take the victory. And it was easy because...
I got a couple presidents I worked for that I would like him to talk to.
Okay, I'm not touching that one.
No, go.
Yeah, but I think, looking at it, Johnson understood. We don't think of this today, but the elderly in the 1960s were one of the poorest segments of our society.
1 out of 3 people before Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are poor.
Exactly.
And then it's 1 out of 10 years later.
Exactly. And so I think, he focused on that as a victory that he could obtain that would sell across the board. If he would have gone for universal health care, it would have been the same fights we saw in the 90s that we see today, and he may not have won anything. So he had to take the one. I won't say it's...
Was he facing criticism at the time that he was trimming his sails before he fought the fight?
From some.
The left
Abe
of the
Rubin,
in New York?
Yeah, they criticized it. But, he also is sitting on the other side. Ronald Reagan's going out and preaching, someday I'm going to talk to my grandchildren, and I'm going to tell them about when America was free before Medicare. He actually said that. And so he's getting hit from all sides, so he takes the task. I mean, it's such a significant victory.
How does he launch it? How does he sell it? Medicare and Medicaid is fulfilling health care, given that it's not the whole enchilada.
Well, I think he sells it as this is a step forward. It may be incremental compared to what you want, but it is a victory that we can obtain. Because it was easy to sell to the American people because you're like, my parents, this is going to help my family and not bankrupt us. And what are we going to do? I just came back from my father breaking his hip and being in the hospital, and without Medicare, we would have just gotten wiped out. And so, that's an easy sell for middle class, even upper middle class, that we're going to change people's lives. We're going to make healthcare a priority. And you're reaching into a section. You're not singling out the poor. Now, it would have been, if he tried to sell it as only the poor, he would have lost.
That's what this gets back to the whole, and his access to higher education are all about economic opportunity regardless of class.
Right.
The war on poverty is restrictive to a segment of society.
Right.
And from a political standpoint, and given he knows words, he knows images, and knows how to project, we talked about the hotel in Dallas, et cetera, from his own political messaging. To me, it seems so restrictive that he was not letting everybody else get bought in.
Right. And I can't explain. I think he saw limitations. And I think this being a Southern Democrat may have shaped his worldview. Because, you can't sell any of this in the South. Let's just be realistic. A lot of this would not sell because it would be seen as, when Southerners thought about poverty, they'd think automatically African American. And so, you're battling all these different things. And I think that's probably contributing to his caution. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying I think that's contributing to it.
The only thing I thought of is that the war on poverty, he knew that from the Appalachians, et cetera, he was bringing in poor
whites.
Yeah. Johnson City.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. And, and he was looking beyond it. It wasn't
that was
just
class was the only way to bring black and white on the same table.
Exactly. Even though you still have the Southern Democrats using the device of George Wallace being the prime example in 68 of what he was able to take advantage of. And, I've made this argument time and time again when I've been interviewed for this book is that, George Wallace, you go watch his speeches and then compare and contrast them to the current president. You will see a lot of resonance. And so,
that's not a good thing.
No, I'm not saying. I'm
it.
just saying, but the resonance and the historical continuity is definitely there.
Did he have any confidence that he'd win 68?
I think so. You look at the polls, he would have. Up until June, July, and August, the polls were showing he would beat Nixon.
Now, he does have, in late 60s, he does have spurts where he's in the 60s and high 50s. So the notion that 68, that he was going to lose, even with the domestic turmoil and the war, it's not I think actually preordained. I would have been, as a betting person,
I would have taken him.
Yeah.
Two things I think it would play. Humphrey was not going to pull any Southern votes for the most part.
Yeah.
The yellow dogs were going to stay, but the majority went Wallace. Johnson would have held on to a much larger percentage, I think. So I think that's one factor. And I think sitting president, going against Nixon, he was going to debate well against Richard Nixon. And he was going to be a significant contrast to Richard Nixon. Humphrey, unfortunately, until the latter part, started gaining, but it took him a while. And those Democrats that were wavering were starting to come back to the party. If it had lasted 2 more weeks, Humphrey might have won. And I think Johnson would have been in a much better. It's hard to defeat a sitting president, even one with Vietnam, because Johnson still had control of the political apparatus.
Well, the country was
Daley,
not where we think it was when it comes to the war.
No.
The great part of the country.
Right, yeah. It was very vocal opposition, but, you still had Richard Daley and people like this that, were still strong stalwarts of Lyndon Johnson, John Conley. They would have pulled very strongly in the Electoral College.
If Johnson was alive, would he ever allow Conley to leave the party and go work for Richard Nixon?
Oh, absolutely not. I think that would,
And Conley wouldn't have done it.
I don't think so. Personally, I didn't know the two. Now, you'd have to interview someone like Larry Temple and people like that who were aides that would know more about this. But I think it would have been highly improbable.
When you look at his career politically, you have the Senate infamous campaign and some of the votes. Unravel that. The other piece is in the shadows of right before Kennedy died, there's a scandal brewing around Johnson. Can you talk about those two moments in his political career and how they influenced his political judgment and give people a little background?
Yeah, well, the 48 election, of course, it is hard fought. and part of it is
hard fought.
Yeah, Texas, and he had lost a similar race in 42. And just by a and he felt like he got
taken.
Yes. And so comes back in 48. Unfortunately, in Texas, just like other places in the world, this happens.
Now, in
and
42, Roosevelt doesn't want him to run, and he defies him.
Yes, he defies him. And in fact, soon after—
I don't mean to point my finger at
No,
you.
no, I don't care. I've had people in my face. And
I just
things
want you to know that I read a couple books.
Yeah,
That's all.
well, no, you've got this down very, very well.
So 42, he defies Roosevelt, which is shocking to me.
Yeah.
But he lost. So the lesson learned in 42, if you're going to cheat to win?
Yeah, the degrees of, someday the boxes may appear miraculously. But Texas politics.
Just kind of like in another election, 60.
I
don't have a problem.
Anything. I wasn't going to say anything.
Yeah,
but
we think Southern Illinois was cheating too.
Yeah, well, that's I'm out of my
What's
realm.
fair is fair.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, and that's part of it is what had happened in 42. I mean, it's like
somebody was going to do it.
Yeah, and so it's within the Democratic primary,
Yeah.
and so I think that's what a lot of people would think. Oh, he was screwing over the Republican. No, this was the Democrats going after the Democrats. So I mean, he's holed up down here in one of the hotels, the Driscoll. He's in a state of— Lady Bird can't even hardly get him out of the hotel because he's thought he's lost again and he's depressed. And then they fight it out. And again, it's the politics of the South Texas swings it for Lyndon Johnson at this point. And South Texas is always going to be a stalwart for Lyndon Johnson.
In South Texas, demographics are?
Primarily Latino, but—
And does that influence the rest of the legislative agenda at some point?
It's, I think—
a contributor?
Yeah, I think it's a contributor. I mean, Texas, and this has been my primary goals as director of the library, is really start bringing in the story of Latinos much more central. We're in a state where it's almost 50% Latino. The future is that. And, typically when we do civil rights, we do a black-white prism. Well, it's much more multi-layered than that.
For Johnson also.
Oh, and for
without
Johnson,
a doubt.
Without a doubt. Just like Barry Goldwater, Native Americans meant different to him being from Arizona. So you're always influenced by where you're from.
So what is the scandal going into
the Bobby Baker.
November? Yeah, the Bobby Baker.
Bobby
Senate's
Baker's
opening investigations.
Yeah, Senate is opening because
And Hoover's playing Hoover's role.
Oh yeah, Hoover is Hoover. We will see Hoover throughout.
Yeah.
But Bobby Baker's worked in the Senate, and he used his position within the Senate to start accumulating power and wealth. And so it does appear like it's going to spill over into Lyndon Johnson. And I don't have all the details, of who knew what, when. I don't think anybody really does, other than the principal participants. Bobby Baker writes a book later called Wheeling and Dealing, I think is what it's called.
But he couldn't, with his levers and relationships, stop the— I mean, what he was worried about was the Senate starting the investigation into what happened.
Right. But then the assassination comes along and kills
And
him. It's buried.
Is Hoover playing a role in feeding it or shutting it down or letting Johnson know that he can turn the spigot off?
I think the latter. I mean, Hoover's everywhere. And in the stories from the 20s forward, I mean, he's a fundamental character and is shaping all agendas.
Well, he usually let people know what he had so he could help them through the very difficult moments.
Look how he manipulated the relationship between Johnson and King.
Yeah.
And tried to poison it. Fortunately, it wasn't until,
He effectively did it with Bobby.
Yeah.
You got Jenkins, you got Baker, you got McPherson.
Moyers.
I was going to— thank you for doing that. So rank them for me and where they all played and what was their kind of role.
Well, Moyers is early on, very prominent.
Right.
And I love Bill Moyers. He's the most fascinating person to ever talk to. I love him to death. If I had to choose one person to go talk to on all of this, that's who I'd go talk to. McPherson has been described as Johnson's conscience. The guy that they described that would really just tear in the Johnson. Nobody else ever tear in the Johnson. Lady Bird handled him in a different way.
Yeah.
They said McPherson would just rip him and act as his conscience. Jenkins had been with him from the earliest days. And many argue when Jenkins left, Johnson was basically— his right hand was cut off. And Jenkins was always there to maintain peace,
balance.
He was the
Knew
one
knew how to manage him.
he knew how to manage him. And Baker was always the wheeler dealer. So, Texans by nature, we like our wheelers and dealers.
The book comes out, The Gatekeeper. He talks about the chief of staff.
Yeah,
In every president, you go back to Cochrane
right.
and others that play a role, and for Roosevelt, that's true for Kennedy. Each advisor has a place in the psyche of a president. It's
Right.
actually one of the unwritten parts
Right.
of presidential history. It's not, and when one person leaves, there's nobody fills it, and there's a hiccup in the
Right.
process that impacts the presidency, in
Well,
my view.
Well, look at Jenkins leaves, and a lot of people say that was a very bad moment for Johnson. Moyers doesn't leave too long after, and so you're seeing some turnover, and you see people coming. Yeah,
The fence gets weak.
it gets weaker. I mean, or some would say maybe stronger. It's
Would Moyers have convinced him to run if he had stayed?
Don't know. Let's call Bill, and we'll ask him because Bill.
Can we use your iPhone? I've got only a little power left in mine.
I'm not sure how much I have, but like I say, if you want to talk to somebody about the Johnson presidency, the one person I'd love
Moyer.
to talk is Bill Moyer. He has read more and knows
I can't
dissertations
believe I got
and
like Hubert
theses.
Humphrey I want to talk about.
Yeah.
I got why he didn't get rid of a couple, the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
Kept him.
Yeah,
Given that where they were on the Cuban Missile Crisis, I would have thought
I can't.
why he didn't clean house after the 64.
Well, let's just be realistic. I would argue it's a Bill Clinton approach. Bill Clinton didn't really want to deal with foreign policy. He wanted to do domestic policy. Johnson was the exact same way. So he ended up bringing in. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
I think I would argue Bill Clinton's presidency, his North Star. Who do you think would be his North Star president?
Probably John Kennedy, but
No.
Who would you say?
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt.
How do you be a great president without a war?
Right.
And that was what, and if you say what, and I'm speaking for a person,
Yeah.
Bill Clinton's greatest disappointment, not getting the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow. I
And
can see that.
everybody, that you got Gore gets it, everybody gets it. He didn't have a war.
Right.
He actually made, if you look at his list, he made more reconciliation peace agreements than any other president and never got recognized for it.
Well, that is true. But I look at it as more the post-1995. More, in that first period is more the domestic. We could talk days about that.
We'll get Frontline to go a series on this. All right, we have a rapid round on Chicago. This is a test.
Okay.
You can't go wrong. So,
Okay.
it's just like, I'm going to make it easy.
Yeah.
Thick or thin pizza?
Thick.
That was pretty good, man. You want to do that? You're ready. Is that true or are you just sucking up?
No. Well, look at this body type. What do you think I'd go with?
I would go svelte on that one. Okay, Cubs socks.
I'm not a baseball fan. Bears.
No.
Oh,
no.
okay. Cubs.
Okay, that was safe. Okay. Sears or the Hancock Building?
Sears.
Okay. Do you know the difference?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah.
The lake or the Chicago River?
Lake.
Okay. 12-inch or 16-inch softball?
Say that again.
So Chicago's famous for 16-inch softball. Do you know it? So
I
you
don't.
Pick. So we'll go with 12.
I'll go with 12 as the norm.
Yeah. You won, so don't worry.
Yeah. Well, like I said.
We're not voting you off the show.
Well,
because
I hope not.
Are you kidding? I got like another 12 hours of tapes I want to play.
Well,
and I got to come back and still get the same kind of treatment here. So I'm sucking up, man.
Well, no, we will treat you well. This has been a great honor.
Kyle,
I would love
cannot
to talk
thank
some
you.
more.
I'm like, this is the closest a kid could get to being at a candy store with no restrictions. I feel like, the chocolate factory,
Oh,
man.
and we haven't even opened it up completely.
Yes, we just.
So-
I think we scratched like his. Yeah.
Yeah, but as a historian by training, this is every day I get to come to the candy store.
You are. It's really. I really am jealous of you.
Oh,
So we
love
have
it.
a thing on Thanksgiving. Every year we rotate where we do Thanksgiving. Next time we're doing it in Chicago, I think you're going to be kicking off the opening of the Emanuel Thanksgiving. So we invite one speaker.
I would love that.
Okay?
I will hold you to that.
Okay. Yeah. We'll get you some thick pizza, and I'll get you a 16-inch softball.
Right. I will like that. I love that. I love.
We are with Kyle Longley, whose new book, LBJ's 1968, Power, Politics, and the Presidency in America's Year of Upheaval. I cannot thank you enough. I can't thank you enough for taking me around. I'm going to make my son and my daughters jealous.
Well,
okay?
And again, we always
And
have
that's
an
what-
open door.
And that's what a father has to do, is make their kids jealous.
I've got two myself, so I try. Very
Thanks,
nice.
Thanks, Kyle.
You've been listening to Chicago Stories with Mayor Emanuel. You can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tweet your guest ideas using hashtag ShyStories. Thanks for listening.